It's not very interesting. What's interesting is Rumsfeld's policies and Chavez's policies. That's if there were newspapers in the country, that's what they would be talking about, not what rhetoric people use. That's gossip. I don't like it, but who cares? I don't think it's constructive. I also don't think it's constructive to actually calling Bush names, to get back to your question. That's very constructive. That's programmed by Karl Rove. What he wants is to have liberal critics ridicule Bush because he says nuclear and misunderestimate and talks with a probably fake Texas accent and so on. In fact, my suspicion is he's probably trained to make grammatical errors so that then he didn't talk like that at Yale, because then he'll be ridiculed by liberals, and then you can come back with the big propaganda apparatus saying, see, those elite liberals who run the world and are sitting drinking French wine and eating quiche don't understand us ordinary guys, the regular guys like the guy working on the assembly line and George Bush who's going back to his ranch to cut brush and so on and so forth. I mean, that's all part of the imagery. So if you want to contribute to that imagery and to the success of the ultra-right, then yes, you should make fun of George Bush's accent and the other forms of ridicule. But mostly it's either destructive or childish. Then the same holds of everyone else's rhetoric. What's important is the content, and that was systematically evaded. Actually, I had the resources. I'd like to do a media search and see if there was any reference to the substance of his remarks. After all, even at the General Assembly, you read the New York Times review, it was what's called a news account. It was mostly kind of gossip and making fun of it and so on. However, they did have a phrase which was interesting. They said he received prolonged applause, so long that the chair had to intervene to stop it. Well, any journalist would ask, or commentator would ask the next question, why? Why did he receive prolonged applause? Is it because he called George Bush a devil? No. It's because he was expressing a point of view which happens to be very widely accepted in the world. In fact, it's the overwhelmingly dominant position. Chavez's views are called controversial. It's quite the opposite. It's the views of the U.S. media and commentators that are controversial. It's not controversial when Chavez says the U.S. is one of the greatest threats to peace in the world. That's not even controversial in Europe. When you take a look at polls in Europe, when people are asked to list the major threats to peace, the United States is way in the lead, not far above Iran or anybody else. So if Chavez says it at the UN, what's controversial? What's controversial is the U.S. position of saying that it's controversial, because it's not. I mean, unless you define the world as the New York Times editorial board, it's not controversial. Well, those are the kind of reports that should have been carried out. Or if you want to talk about Venezuela, every reference that I see calls Chavez, tin pot dictator, so on and so forth. And by what standards is he a dictator? I mean, he's been repeatedly elected in elections certified as free and fair. He allowed the media in Venezuela bitterly condemn him in terms which are unimaginable virtually in the United States. There was a military coup that briefly overthrew him. It was supported by the top media. They haven't been punished for it. Supported, of course, by the Bush administration. They've had a series of referendums, all of which he's won handily, without any coercion that anyone knows about, or certainly not by international standards. But the most important question is, what do Venezuelans think about him? I mean, after all, that's the question you ask about a political leader. Well, we know. In the years that he's been in office, support for the elected government has steadily risen. It is now the highest in Latin America. Well, that's of some interest. The next question is to ask what the reasons are. I mean, is it because he calls Bush a devil? No, it's because there are social programs that are helping the great majority of the population. Should be a very rich country, Venezuela, plenty of resources. It has a small, very small, super rich, elite, highly privileged sectors, and a huge mass of extremely impoverished people who apparently believe, you can argue about whether they're right or not, but they seem to believe that this is the first government that's ever cared for them. Is that undemocratic? In fact, what's called undemocratic here is extremely interesting. So, for example, when Morales in Bolivia made moves towards nationalization of Libya's resources, he was condemned as authoritarian, dictatorial, attacking democracy. Did it matter that he was supported by about 95% of the population? And is that what dictatorial means? We have a particular concept of democratic, which means do what we say, then you're democratic. You do what the population wants, you're not democratic. Doesn't every newspaper you read, every journal commentary, every scholarly article talks about Bush's commitment to bring democracy and freedom to the world? I was just listening to the BBC this morning driving in. They're talking about, well, some of his actions don't seem to conform to his commitment to bring democracy to the world. What's the evidence for the commitment? I mean, the evidence is the dear leader pronounced it.